Oh, yeah.
That's so bad. Okay, so if anybody wants, I have these two little mini tests that I copied a while ago. They're not my little multiple choice questions. I just want something to kind of look at, do a little more practice. If you want those, go and pick those up on the way out. Tomorrow we're going to come into class. You're going to sit down and take a review test. Now, unfortunately, you're going to have to staple the review test too, because somebody who will remain nameless forgot to put down staple. Instead, they put down 3 bold, put a 3-hole punch through it. I don't know who that person is, but I'm very disappointed in them, aka me. So you have to cook staple, but you just pick up a page and all lay it out. So there's another practice test, and for those of you that took almost all of you are taking the AP exam, so make sure you're there by 7:45. You know the routine about that. Be multiple choice and short answer questions. Take like a 10-minute break, and then the essays. And if you're not taking the AP exam, there's a few that aren't in all the classes. Just normal school day for you. I'll give you a chance to work on that. We might work on you still have to turn in the review packet. And I figure out something to do. We'll see how many people there are going to be. But we'll go from there. And so let's go ahead and look at the review packet on page, where are we at here? Page 10. And so, everybody, before we get to anything else, go to the Warren Court. See the Warren Court? I think I mentioned that on the review packet. This is probably the most liberal court, or probably the most conservative court in history right now. Well, it's close, 1890s. So we've done a complete 180. But from the Warren Court, that's on page not 10. Near the bottom, there are 3 court cases that have popped up on the exam. The first one is Engel versus Vitale. Engel versus Vitale said that there could be no mandated school prayer. No mandated school prayer in schools. So they could not do a school prayer that, in fact, the way it was is we would all do a prayer together. In fact, by the 1960s, it was on the announcements, we'd all do a prayer together. They said that could no longer be mandated in school. So no mandated school prayer. Now, you can pray anytime you want. You could be praying right now that this class would end, but that's up to you. You decide that's for your own personal needs. But that is, and so that's school prayer. The next one right next to it is, let's make sure I got the order right here. Griswold versus Connecticut, probably one of the most important court cases in American history. And that would give people the right to privacy. The people the right to privacy. And the big thing about that one was it overturned a law in Connecticut that said women could not take birth control pills. And so it says it is a right to privacy for women to take birth control pills. Therefore, we have an inherent right to privacy, even though that is not mandated in the U.S. Constitution. And this is probably one of the most liberal pro-civil rights rulings in American history. This is the ruling that the more conservative jurists absolutely despise. And so, in fact, this is one of the things they are talking about targeting in the next couple of years. We'll see. Could happen. But that's a big, and we'll come back to that in just 1 second. The last one is Miranda. And Miranda, there's a few decisions around there. Gideon's another one, but Miranda's one we have to know, where it says that everybody must be made aware of their constitutional rights. That's part of their due process, their constitutional rights. If they're arrested or potentially arrested. And so you ever hear, watch movies and they say you have the right to remain silent, and you say, that is your Miranda rights. And they do not have to tell you those things, but when this became, with this rule in 1960, they started giving police departments a little 3x5 card. So you have to say these rights. And it became easier to just give everyone the same card. And so what it means is everyone has these certain due process rights, and that comes under the 5th and 14th Amendment. And so is a big ruling. But let's get back to Griswold. That Griswold decision is probably one of the most important issues in history for women's rights. Before Griswold, women were literally under the law second-class citizens. And so we are going to skip ahead just a little bit to the bottom of page 11. And if you get to the bottom of page 11, you see a couple different things right there. We'll get to in just one second, but a quarter of the way down, it's Planned Parenthood or Sanger and the Pill. And Planned Parenthood was an organization created by Margaret Sanger. Why do we have two people targeting? Let's go. Okay, when someone sneaks behind me like that, I find it a little bit disconcerting. But Planned Parenthood said that, Margaret Sanger, and the idea was that family planning would be one of the most important ways that families can, or one of the most important benefits for women's rights and for families to decide their income. Because kids, I don't know if you know this, are shockingly expensive. You are expensive. But, in fact, that's part of the reason why I think birth rates are declining so fast in the U.S. It's like really shockingly fast. We'll see where that goes right at this moment. But that's family planning. But so they would work tirelessly for a way for women to have control over her own body and reproductive rights. And the big achievement by Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood would be the birth control pill. And this would be in the late 1950s. And there's been no single thing that has been more important for women's rights than the birth control pill. Because if women can't decide when they're going to have children, this is a massive economic hit on them. A massive economic hit. Because especially before the pill, women were routinely fired or laid off or not allowed promotion if they got pregnant. In fact, that was a norm for teachers up until the 1970s. You're pregnant, you're gone. And without birth control, reproductive rights, women would have significantly fewer rights. That's why any attack on reproductive rights is a direct attack on women's economic rights. You can make other moral equivalents to that, but I had to get to that one of the pill because it directly relates to Griswold. Oh, since it's right next to it, let's go right to Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade was abortion rights, and this was a 7-2 ruling that said women have rights to abortion, but the Supreme Court ruling was so convoluted that you ever heard of trimesters? That came out of Roe versus Wade. And they just basically, justice who wrote it, guy named Harry Blackman, just kind of said the first 3 months there could be no restrictions on women's reproductive rights. Next 3 months, some restrictions. Next 3 months, some more restrictions. Which is like, they literally just created this. And now people say this all the time, and it all comes to Roe versus Wade. But this is the second most important issue for women's economic legal rights. The same deal, if they can't decide when they're going to have a child, is a huge economic hit. This was a 7-2 ruling, and it was not very controversial when it happened. But by the late 1970s, this would become one of the most divisive political issues in American history. The right to abortion is now, when I was your age, it was pretty much a complete choice, or the women have the right to decide for their own body. Today, that right's being taken away, so it's really curious to see what's going to happen for you when you get a little bit older. But these rights are going away. But that's a big issue for economic rights. I have to go very quickly over that. So I just want to get those court cases very quickly. Let's go back to page 10, and we have the debates, election of 1860, the New Frontier. What's the space race? We'll come back to the space race. Space race was a big element of the Cold War, but I'm going to fast forward to the Bay of Pigs. So let's find the Bay of Pigs, which is right below the Warren Court. I'll come back to the Freedom Riders. So when Castro took power, it was decided he was a communist. The Eisenhower administration came up with a plan to do like they did in Guatemala, trigger a popular uprising in Cuba by invasion of Cuban exiles. Most of them were actually thugs who were paid off by organized crime. But they trained them in Guatemala, no coincidence. And that was a plan. Kennedy didn't like the plan because it wasn't his plan, but he was stuck with it because he couldn't go back to it because if it came out he didn't do Eisenhower's plans, he looked soft on communism. So the plan was to invade in this bay here known as the Bay of Pigs. And the thought was the people of Cuba would rise up and overthrow the tyrant Castro. As it turned out, Castro was shockingly popular in Cuba because he stood up to the United States. Remember the Teller Amendment and the Platt Amendment and those issues. And this triggered the popular uprising. And this is a funny one about Kennedy, but it failed miserably, absolutely miserably. And here's the Cuban cigar blowing up in Kennedy's face. An absolute disaster. Kennedy looked weak, looked soft on communism, and after this, politically destroyed the new frontier. None of those programs were passed except for defense spending. And Kennedy, even though he was a liberal Democrat who wanted to finish the New Deal, he really became the arms race candidate. So, Bay of Pigs. We're not done with the Bay of Pigs, because then Castro became a real thorn in America's side. Well, Khrushchev and Kennedy were going to have a summit. It blew up, both men trying to look tough. Khrushchev's still mad about the U-2, Kennedy's mad about this, and we're leading to, Berlin. Berlin. So we've got the Berlin Wall. So we've got the Berlin Wall next, are we right? Everyone's up, should be right next to it. I'm just making sure. So the Berlin Wall. And what's happening was this. There's a brain drain. All these people from the east were going to East Berlin, crossing over to the west, and not coming back. This was a free, open border. And it really showed, especially young people, that the Soviet system was not working. This repressive totalitarian state. Shocking. Wasn't working. Khrushchev wanted it to work. Kennedy would refuse to do anything. Kennedy thought this was an aggressive action. And so literally, by the way, this is what they would give U.S. soldiers who were based in this part of West Berlin, the Tempelhof region, which is where my brother-in-law was in Berlin and grew up in. And so in August of 1861, to stop that brain drain, just literally overnight, they constructed a wall between East and West Berlin. So the king put barbed wire up. Here are East German guards. This guy with these sunglasses was East German soldier, and since they must have thought he looked like somebody, wow, that's like our classic East German. So he was in newspapers all over the U.S., this guy. That became one of the more famous faces. But overnight, they built this wall to keep that brain drain from happening. And it literally cut families in half. It was really common for people in the West to buy an apartment in the East because it was so cheap, it just crossed. And so sometimes they were stuck. Sometimes half the family was on one side, half the family was on the other side. It was just nobody had any warnings. Boom, there's the wall. Yeah.
What's brain drain again?
Brain drain, people from the East were going to the West. And the thought was they were younger, better educated people. That's brain drain. Khrushchev did this as an act of pure desperation. But in the West, it looked like an act of war. He's trying to surround and slowly squeeze West Germany and West Berlin and take it over. Now, that's not at all what he wanted to do, but this also shows how the Soviet system is in real trouble. It's in real trouble. It's not working. Well, the U.S. did this act aggressively. As I said before, here's making the escape. Here's looking over the wall. Pretty soon a more permanent wall would come up with minefields, secondary walls, watchtowers. It became one of the most guarded areas of the world. And there's only a little bits of the wall left. When the wall came down, they just destroyed it. In fact, that's November 9, 1989. I still can't get over this. It still blows me away. Because I was so ingrained in the Cold War, and the wall became to symbolize the Cold War. Well, actually, as dangerous as it was, and there will be a few confrontations, it actually led to a safer situation between the East and the West. But John Kennedy would go, oh, here's where the wall looked, and then barbed wire all the way around. Yeah.
So people, if they wanted to switch sides, could they just like drive out and go around?
Oh, no. They barbed wire this all up.
Okay.
And then the wall would be here. And so there were 3 roads that connected East and West, connected West Berlin to West Germany. And they were like barbed wire, like little tunnels you'd go through. And if you came off, because they're autobahns, you took the exit, you'd be met by armed guards, and you had to prove you had to be there, or vice versa. Yeah, so Berlin still has this very insular, like an island. It really does feel like an island to this day. It's very interesting. Berlin's it's a fun place, yeah.
So, did the French, British, and Americans just not know that they were putting barbed wire around their sectors?
Well, they had where they put the barbed wire was still in East Germany or West Berlin, so it's not their sector. And what could they do? You go to war, blow the world up. Yeah, that was the hard part. What do you do? Yeah. And so when it happened, it just happened like, and that's why they did it overnight. So there'd be no chance. Just boom, it's there. Fait accompli. You have no choice. John Kennedy would go there and make one of his most famous speeches, where he would lay out that we, citizens of the United States, will treat West Berlin as part of the U.S. And we will defend it like it's part of the U.S. And this really alleviated West German fears. And in it, he would make one of his more famous comments, where he responded, "I am a citizen of Berlin." But immediately people started joking and say he really didn't say that. Let's see if this works. Sorry. Oh, where did it go? Sorry, it didn't come. Let's try one more time. And there's the actual phonetic spelling of it he got from the actual mayor of West Berlin. But pretty soon people started saying, well, actually a Berliner is not just a citizen of Berlin. By the way, to say it in proper German, it's Berliner, so he has that phonetically spelled. A Berliner is also a Jolly Donut. And so people said, hey, what he was actually saying was he was a Jelly Donut. Ha, 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 ha. And when I was there, I actually bought a sticker that with a Jelly Donut saying, Ich bin ein Berliner. No, he did not say he was a Jelly Donut. That's actually the proper way to say it, but it's a good joke. So you hear people today say, oh yeah, it's a Jelly Donut. He didn't actually say that. But it's still kind of funny. All right, so actually, this led to a stalemate and it reduced the tension. It really did. And maybe I'll tell you some stories my brother-in-law told me about getting East German guards to point their guns at him because my brother-in-law, very successful architect, is also insane. So with that, okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there's the Brandenburg Gate, there was a wall. On the West German side is all this graffiti. Parts of it are still there, and there's a museum that has about just a small section. If you ever get a chance, go. It's really fascinating and scary. So with that, let's get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But you have to start the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just put this really quick. Mongoose was the plan to assassinate Castro. And the plan was either to use like exploding cigars or some kind. They had all these plans. Maybe I'll spend a few minutes after the death telling you some stories, good stories, but to assassinate Castro. And Castro took this as, oh my God, they're trying to kill me. At the same time, the United States is dramatically building up its missiles, easily surpassing the Soviets 10-1. Soviets will catch up, but still 10-1. And they tried to invade the Bay of Pigs. And the Soviets were really desperate, as seen with the Berlin Wall. Both Castro and Khrushchev felt weak. And both of them felt they had to deter an American attack. Now that should show you how terrified they were. They were convinced that any moment the U.S. might attack. Almost the same thing would happen in '83. And fortunately, I did not know this at the time, but they came within a few hours of attacking in '83. If your U.S. is going to attack, we need to do a preemptive strike. And you wouldn't have to worry about Thursday. It was really close. And I'll tell you the '79 one, it was within a minute. I'm really glad I didn't know about that one. Well, by the way, this was a cover of Mad Magazine, and they didn't know that CIA actually did try to plant explosive guards in Castro to blow up his head. Yep, Castro knew. What is this going to lead to? The Cuban Missile Crisis. October 14th to October 28th, the Soviet Union put missiles into Cuba. Now, I will tell you some stories about this because it's an amazing story. But a U-2 flight on October 14th found missiles in Cuba. Soviet medium and short-range missiles. Now, the United States had missiles right on the Soviet border in Turkey, right there, right on the border. Also had missiles in Japan, Norway, and Italy, and missiles in the United States. The Minuteman I missiles around Mausterbeck are in and active at that moment. 200 of them. Well, 100 were ready to go, 100 were just about ready. But the thing about it is those missiles could hit Washington, D.C., the medium-range ones, they could reach Washington, D.C. in about 8 minutes. That's not enough time to do anything. Not enough time to do anything. Missile defense was impossible then, it's basically impossible now. And so, no American president could tolerate missiles that close. Think about what he'd be blamed on. You allowed missiles into Cuba? How soft on communism can you be? By the way, both sides were making submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and the submarines are basically undetectable, and they could launch right off the border of the United States or the Soviet Union. And they could do that right now. Russian ballistic missile submarines just kind of orbit right off the east coast of the U.S. and off the west coast 24 hours a day right now. So it was already kind of happening. But the missiles you can see them. They're not submarines hidden underwater. And so with that, the options were, you have to write down the options. But deployment is weak, airstrike might not work, invasion, really scary. What if they invade Berlin? Berlin was on the back of their mind. If we invade, we have Berlin. So that's the only thing we have to know. We invade, they might take Berlin. So they did a quarantine, and that's what we have to get. A quarantine. Now, it's technically a blockade, but a blockade is an act of war, so they call it a quarantine. They'll say they'll allow no Soviet ships at first 200, within 100 miles within Cuba. And Kennedy announced this to the public, this quarantine. This is almost an act of war on the 22nd. In fact, no warning, boom, it came. All over the United States, they were told that nuclear war might happen at any moment. Every city, every school, every place, and also Europe and Japan and Canada did air raid warnings, and then they said the next one's a real one. And so for almost a week, the world was on a knife's edge. It was that scary. I'll tell you a story about that after the exam. And this video is now invalid. Thank you, YouTube. But that was just a video of him talking about it. Well, the next day, Soviet ships arrived at the blockade line. There was a confrontation with U.S. Navy ships. The Soviet ships stopped, and for 4 days, there's stalemate out there. 4 days. At the last minute, the U.S. and the Soviet Union came to an agreement. Actually, the Americans had a timeline for midnight or noon on the 28th. The United States received the message on the 20th. Direct communication, so they had to do it over the radio. They broadcast on the radio, and they intercept broadcast of that. There's no direct phone lines. And October 28th, the U.S. said they would not invade Cuba. So the U.S. said, we won't invade Cuba, there'll be not another Bay of Pigs, and the Soviets agreed to pull the bombs out. So that's what you need to know for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Everyone got that? That's how close it was. Kennedy would be attacked for being soft on communism, but he saved the world. And this is where Kennedy actually proved his effectiveness as a leader, because virtually all of his advisors freaked out on the 26th and wanted to blow the world up. And if he would have been a weaker leader, it might have happened. I'll tell you that story. 4 different times in one day. That close. They were freaking out. But in secret, the United States also agreed to pull out their old missiles out of Turkey and Italy. Now, Kennedy said, we can't allow people to know this because it'll look weak, even though we were going to pull them out already because they're obsolete. But that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was that close. Out of this, 2 big things we have to get out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. There could be a limited test ban treaty, which eventually would lead to a full test ban treaty 20 years later, but no more open atmospheric tests. All those tests in Nevada quit, and also a hotline, a direct telegraph line connecting the Kremlin to Washington, D.C. Later on, this would be a phone line. And so you see in movies, they'll pick up like the red phone and they'll be talking. That was all just removed. It was just a telegraph line that would be secure. So they wouldn't have to broadcast things on the radio. So, from that, what's going to come out of this? And let's turn the page. So we have the end of the Cold War, which is going to be on page 12, a third of the way down on the right. This is the biggest single factor on ending the Cold War. The Soviet leaders that would follow after Khrushchev would be humiliated and ousted. Leonid Brezhnev, and by the way, that man to me when I growing up was the face of the Soviet Union. This old Stalinist with massive eyebrows. Of course, I've noticed during COVID, it seems like my eyebrows are going exponentially too. So it must be something to do. I mean, I'm just wondering about that. I'm kind of scared. But the Soviets vowed to never fall behind again. And 50% of their economy is going to go to building weapons. 50%. And what's going to happen? Why is this going to end the Cold War? In the 1980s, their economy would collapse. Their economy would collapse, and the arms buildup that started in '64. Has everyone got that? That would end the Cold War. Because in 1989, the whole thing fell like a house of cards. Now, partially it was Gorbachev, but Gorbachev's trying to save this. So this is the biggest single factor. Has everyone got that for the end of the Cold War? It's this. The Soviet foolishness to try to keep up. And eventually they would build 80,000 nuclear weapons. More enough to blow up the world, trying to get my numbers right, only about 2,000 times. So let's get into the sit-ins. The sit-ins a little bit above that on page 10. The sit-ins and the Freedom Riders. The sit-ins were an example of civil disobedience, where the civil rights movement, sometimes Martin Luther King was just simply called the movement. We talked about that with Birmingham and watching the Rage Within. This was to go into segregated restaurants and force the store owners, actually force the police to arrest them so they could get a court case. So these are civil disobedience to stop Jim Crow laws. Has everyone got that for the sit-ins? Don't worry about the SCLC. We don't have time for that right now. Another component of that would be the Freedom Riders. And this was to challenge Plessy versus Ferguson. They went into the South riding segregated buses, but they rode them integrated, but they also wanted to not only challenge Plessy by integrating Greyhound buses, but also to get to register people to vote. And they would be attacked. Some people would be lynched by the police. In fact, outside of Birmingham, Alabama, so Freedom Riders challenged Plessy. Their bus would be firebombed. One bus would be firebombed outside of Birmingham, Alabama, and the state police would arrest the riders for instigating a revolt, a riot. And this man right here is John Lewis. He just passed away last year, but he would be a member of the United States Congress for 30 years after that, when he started off as a Freedom Rider. The bill to try to reestablish voting rights again is named the John Lewis bill. It's in the House, it's bogged down like everything in the Senate. Senate passes nothing because of the filibuster. So, we're jumping right to here. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And so, after bitter attacks and Kennedy not getting the civil rights passed, civil rights leaders and labor union leaders decided to have a march on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And the big thing about this March on Jobs and Freedom was to force Kennedy to act. Force Northern Democrats and some Northern Republicans who claimed they were for civil rights to push him through Congress. Because these laws were stifled in Congress. So that was the force. And actually, Kennedy begged them not to do it. But this was to force action, and that's what protests do. There's a bunch of laws now to try to ban protests right now, because protests work. And don't protest here. These are my cause. And the big element was for economic justice and also to push the Civil Rights Act. So that's 1963. Martin Luther King would make one of his most famous speeches were the I Had a Dream. That was kind of the shtick he would do at the end of the speech. He would always kind of get rolling on that to get everyone going. That's what people remember, but it's also kind of funny in a way. But ironically, this would help trigger a conservative backlash. And it's actually pretty shocking, the reaction of especially white Americans to this. A Gallup poll in August of 1963, 60% of Americans were opposed to the March on Washington. Opposed. And so the desire to end Jim Crow laws and end segregation was actually pretty unpopular amongst white people in the United States. There was a lot of, well, your turn, it's not so bad. You'll get your chance. And the same thing with 57% thought sit-ins and freedom riders were bad at that time. And so there's kind of belief that Martin Luther King was almost like popular. No, he was bitterly attacked. Now, what do we have to get to on that? If you look at the bottom of page 11, I have conservative backlash. One of the big elements of the conservative resurgence of the 1970s through today was also the backlash against civil rights. The backlash against civil rights. It's also the backlash against the anti-war movement and the backlash against feminism. Would help trigger the conservative revival of the 1980s. Okay, so let's get very quickly back to Vietnam. And Kennedy, I mentioned the whole thing about Kennedy kind of stuck with this thing that Eisenhower started. Well, here are the other reasons Kennedy would give. And the ones we already kind of know, the domino theory, where the U.S. must start committing more forces, and eventually there'll be 16,000 advisors in Vietnam. Now, we mentioned the domino theory before, but Berlin was a big issue. And the other one was civil rights. Kennedy thought, I'll never get any civil rights acts passed if they keep shoving Vietnam in my face. We got to show that we can win in civil rights. So he's got to get reelected. So Kennedy is making Vietnam important. He's making it important. And so with that, by the way, Vietnam was falling apart by the summer of '63. Have you ever seen these pictures? These are Buddhist monks who were protesting the corrupt government that the United States backed up. And a number of them burnt themselves alive, with the idea being to show their civil disobedience to this. And a few did it, but this would be a very popular scene. Now, they weren't pro-Viet Cong necessarily. They were opposed to the corrupt government the U.S. supported. The problem with this is, for the United States, this doesn't look like we're doing very well. And it looked like at any moment the government of South Vietnam might collapse. But we don't know what Kennedy would have done, because at this last moment, on November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. He was in Dallas, Texas, actually promoting the arms race and how well we're doing in Vietnam. He was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. He was in Dallas. There was actually a lot of, he's a traitor and a Red. He was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald was a confirmed communist who actually tried to defect to the Soviet Union. Turned out it wasn't the paradise he thought, and came back, and then became obsessed with his love of Castro in Cuba. And ironically, just a month before Kennedy was assassinated, the CIA would approve a coup in South Vietnam, assassinating the leader of South Vietnam. A lot of people thought they were connected. It appeared to be not connected, but Oswald, they had more evidence than you can imagine that Oswald did it. But what made it very strange, 2 days after this, a strip club owner named Jack Ruby assassinated Oswald. And it appeared as though he was trying to alleviate the pain of the trial. In fact, he thought he'd be treated as a hero. He'd die in prison of pancreatic cancer. But this made it appear like something more was going on. And the big thing about the Kennedy assassination, I should add, now about 70% of the population think there was a broad conspiracy to kill Kennedy, maybe involving the CIA, Soviet intelligence, the mob, the reanimated brain of Adolf Hitler, and aliens. And I'm only slightly exaggerating about that. The Kennedy assassination was pretty amazing, but if you know anything about like this big wave of people believing conspiracies like QAnon, Americans are very apt to believe wild conspiracy theories. Really apt. And since I did get a vaccine and I'm fully vaccinated, and it's an amazing vaccine. That's one of the greatest scientific achievements in world history. But also, of course, it put a microchip in me. And there's no coincidence that Bill Gates just got a divorce. See, it all fits together, right? I mean, right? And then if you take the number 7 and divide the number 7 by 2, what do you get?
3 now.
That's what they want you to think. Right? Right? So, with that, I should add, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, would do the Warren Commission, would promote the Warren Commission, where one of the biggest investigations in history that would look into the assassination. And what they basically said was the Russians and Cubans didn't do it. There was a real fear. If they did it, that might be World War III. They had nothing to do with it. Oswald acted alone. But over the years, more and more people began to believe there was a government cover-up. And so the Warren Commission, which did make some mistakes, because the CIA and the FBI really screwed up and tried to cover it up. The FBI had Oswald under surveillance. Wow, what a screw up if you let a guy you have under surveillance assassinate the president. Yeah.
Well, didn't he issue a threat to a CIA agent? He could have been arrested for that.
An FBI agent.
FBI.
He said, quit following me. You have to arrest him. He wouldn't be arrested for that, but he said, quit following. Because he thought the FBI was harassing him. They were following him because he tried to defect to the Soviet Union and came back. So at that, Lyndon Johnson is now president, and that would lead to the Great Society. And this was going to be Lyndon Johnson's massive plan to finish the New Deal. And so he would create this Great Society. What he's going to do is finish what Kennedy started. And it's going to be basically 3 parts. Whether that's him giving the speech, that's an old teleprompter. You actually had a piece of paper rolling. Now they're reflected off a glass screen. You ever seen those glass screens when you see a president talk? That's a teleprompter. They're reflecting the speech off of that. Lyndon Johnson of Texas. The Southerner, and everybody was shocked what a fighter he was to finish the New Deal. The first part was civil rights. Civil rights. Now, the second part would be register down a war on poverty. The poverty rate was still about 25%, and they're going to try to attack poverty in a very hackneyed way. Poverty rate would go down to about 9%. But these went against conservative economics. As soon as you have Reagan and Reaganomics, poverty rate went back up to about 14%. Now it's sitting around 14 to 20%, depending on how we come out of COVID. But civil rights, and the third part would be a great expansion of what he called civil life, but in aid for arts and science and education. Massive aid, which would be cut back. But this is where public television will come out. And originally it was going to be funded by the federal government. Now it's only slightly funded by federal government. It's mostly by private donations. But let's get to civil rights. If you turn the page upon the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. This would pass over a 60-day filibuster. And this would say no discrimination based upon race or sex. Actually, Southern Democrats and conservative Republicans threw in sex, no discrimination based upon sex, because they thought that would scuttle the bill. Nobody would ever believe that women deserve equal rights. Well, as it turned out, liberal Democrats were for equal rights for this. Kind of. And that would pass. And so there is no guarantee of equal rights for women to this day. No guarantee at all. But it is under the law, the Civil Rights Act of 1960. What an important law. So this basically mostly ended Jim Crow laws. If you look a little bit further down, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 got rid of the literacy test and made it easier for people to vote. It opened up voting. And also said that any laws that might discriminate have got to be approved by the federal government. In the grandfather's clause, and one thing I should add, this dramatically increased voting, but the Supreme Court ruled this mostly unconstitutional 8 years ago. Basically, the Supreme Court said, actually, they did say in the ruling that there is no more racism in the United States, and so this is no longer necessary. And that's why all of a sudden we have all these laws restricting voting now, including in Montana. Once they did that, you will find out when you go to college and try to vote. It's going to be a lot harder for you to vote in Montana. It's happening all over the country. So it's a big shift. Oh, so I got through a lot of things. So if anybody wants this practice session, grab here. I will go over anything you want. I'm going to review tonight at 7. But if you want to come in quick at lunch and review, I'll be glad to answer any questions you have. Tomorrow we are going to take a practice test in class. But some of these things you're going to have to look in the review book and get on your own. There's still a little bit left you have to get. All right. 7 to 9. Goodbye.